Once upon a time, Grace Aisleway carried a motion cart prop into grocery-feeling maze set because grocery store maze had apparently become a tiny household ceremony. Tiny, polite pressure waited nearby. The object looked harmless, which is how many modern consumer problems introduce themselves before asking for an email address. The receipt stayed quietly theatrical. Grace Aisleway did not want drama. She wanted one simple purchase, one simple choice, and maybe a quiet evening with fewer pop-ups. Convenience wore its soft slippers, but the village of modern shopping had a talent for making ordinary decisions, wear velvet capes, and ring little bells. The bargain kept excellent posture. This is the story of the grocery store maze of feelings, retold as a tiny clay disaster with warm lighting and suspiciously excellent manners. Nobody trusted the math yet. At first, the problem was small, a shopping list that entered the store with confidence sitting in the corner like it had never ruined anyone's budget. A tiny committee formed emotionally. The village believed a grocery trip is only about food and not a small financial weather system, which sounded reasonable only if nobody looked directly at the receipt. The button looked too pleased. So Grace Aisleway nodded, smiled, and stepped closer, because confident design can make a trap feel like customer service. The room practiced innocent faces. The first promise was charming. Every aisle offered comfort wearing a price tag. A soft little trap smiled. It did not shout, threaten, or twirl a mustache. It simply used friendly colors and acted like the sensible option. The props understood the joke. Price tag. Oracle appeared nearby with the calm face of a creature who had read the terms and conditions for sport. Every corner felt lightly sponsored. Nobody called it a monster yet, because consumer culture prefers softer words until the invoice has finished stretching. The silence had checkout energy. Then came the tiny nudge, the helpful suggestion, the little button that seemed to know exactly where the human thumb lived. Even the table looked concerned. Grace Aisleway felt smart for noticing the deal, which is one of the most expensive feelings a bargain can sell. Tiny polite pressure waited nearby. One more click became one more choice, and one more choice became a hallway with cheerful lights and no obvious exit. The receipt stayed quietly theatrical. The village applauded convenience, because convenience is beloved when it arrives, before the consequences have put on shoes. Convenience wore its soft slippers. By then, shrinking budget map prop had entered the scene looking official enough to make nonsense feel organized. The bargain kept excellent posture. It was not evil. It was worse in a smaller way because it was useful, polite, and very hard to blame. Nobody trusted the math yet. Every option arrived carrying a tiny explanation, and every explanation brought a cousin named just in case. A tiny committee formed emotionally. Grace Aisleway tried to stay practical, but practicality kept getting distracted by little savings, little upgrades, and little emotional fireworks. The button looked too pleased. That is how the ceremony works. It shrinks the decision until the person forgets the total shape of the thing. The room practiced innocent faces. Soon, the budget map folded itself into a tiny apology, and the room became 2 emotional degrees colder. A soft little trap smiled. Price tag Oracle did a silent little bow, the kind performed by systems that are technically optional and somehow everywhere. The props understood the joke. The strangest part was that no single step looked outrageous. Every corner felt lightly sponsored. Each step looked tiny, reasonable, and almost boring, which is exactly how a maze avoids being recognized as a maze. The silence had checkout energy. Grace Aisleway began collecting questions the village did not want to answer. Even the table looked concerned. Who benefits when the obvious price hides behind soft language? Tiny, polite pressure waited nearby. Who profits when canceling, comparing, choosing, or pausing? Feels like a tiny administrative quest. The receipt stayed quietly theatrical. And why does every helpful feature need to stand between a person and the simple truth of what they are buying? Convenience wore its soft slippers. The answers did not arrive dramatically. They arrived like receipts, one pale strip at a time. The bargain kept excellent posture. A tiny pile formed on the table, and the pile had the personality of a tired accountant. Nobody trusted the math yet. Grace Aisleway finally noticed the trick. The product was not only selling an object, service, or shortcut. A tiny committee formed emotionally. It was selling the feeling that friction had disappeared, while quietly moving the friction into the future. The button looked too pleased. That future was small at first, almost cute, like a little Bill wearing pajamas. The room practiced innocent faces, but small future problems are still problems. They just arrive with better timing and fewer witnesses. A soft little trap smiled. The village kept saying, "Do not worry, this is normal." The props understood the joke. Normal, unfortunately, is not the same thing as harmless. Sometimes normal is just a costume that repetition wears. Every corner felt lightly sponsored. Grace Aisleway looked at a motion cart prop, then at shrinking budget map prop, and felt the whole little theater become less magical. The silence had checkout energy. The colors were still friendly, the buttons were still rounded, and the promise was still humming in a cheerful key. Even the table looked concerned. But now the trick had edges. Tiny, polite pressure waited nearby. So Grace Aisleway did the dangerous adult thing and made the decision visible. The receipt stayed quietly theatrical. She counted the cost, named the pressure, and refused to let a tiny convenience pretend it was destiny. Convenience wore its soft slippers. The room did not explode because most consumer spells are weaker when someone turns on the overhead light. The bargain kept excellent posture. Price tag oracle shrank a little, not into nothing, but into its proper size, a tool, not a ruler. Nobody trusted the math yet. The village grumbled because it loved a good ceremony and hated a boring, clear answer. A tiny committee formed emotionally. Still, something useful happened. The choice became a choice again. The button looked too pleased. Not a lifestyle identity, not a secret test of discipline, not a maze with a checkout button wearing a crown. The room practiced innocent faces, just a choice sitting on the table beside a person who had finally stopped performing for the purchase. A soft little trap smiled. That was the tiny miracle hidden inside the mess. The props understood the joke. Shopping gets strange when need, mood, price, and memory share one cart. Every corner felt lightly sponsored. After that, Grace Aisleway still bought things, because this is a fable, not a cave-dwelling manifesto. The silence had checkout energy, but she bought them with fewer illusions, fewer ceremonial clicks, and a much smaller audience in her head. Even the table looked concerned, and somewhere in cold checkout scale, set the maze exit was beside the receipt, quietly blinking, which was embarrassing for everyone except the truth. Tiny, polite pressure waited nearby.